Okay, so this is going to be part 11 of the Mackyard incident. Okay, so now that we're done the review of everything, we're going to be picking up with the new information now. And so let's keep going. The next section here on page 23 had to do with skill deficiency identification during conductor training. So here it says, a broader and more detailed audit of CN operations was conducted by Transport Canada in 2005 and 2006. An analysis of the fast track conductor training matches Transport Canada's broader findings. Recordings and tracking of details was inadequate and often inaccurate. Why are we surprised? If you look at my video in the series on the players, one of those players is the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And in that video, I explain how in the rail industry in Canada, potentially up to 40% of incidents had not been reported to Transport Canada by rail carriers such as CN Rail. So you'll want to look at that. So, if they're not even bothering to report collisions or derailments or whatever, in many, many cases, why would we be surprised to see that there is little, if any, formal, why would we be surprised to see that recordings and tracking of details was inadequate and often inaccurate? They don't want to document it, folks. They don't want to document all the problems, because then we would really see just how bad things really are. And when they do document the things that are really bad, oh gee, maybe we're just going to classify those reports like we did for the other two belt packs incidents in Mackyard, the one before the Mackyard incident in September and the one after. Also two incidents that happened in Mackyard, so they had bang, 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 three very nasty incidents, and things still have not changed, and the training programs were not overhauled to this day, 18 years later. And now Transport Canada is in a rush to try and overhaul these programs behind the scenes. That was what Chrystia Freeland, the new Minister of Transportation, was going to be working on. But now, wait, she's jumping ship. She's the new envoy for Canada to rebuild Ukraine. And the guy who's now going to be the Minister of Transportation for Canada is a guy by the name of Stephen McKinnon. He was Minister of Labour when they had the CP and CN strike in 2024 in June. And he's the one who forced them to arbitration, where they basically, accomplished basically nothing. They got a small increase in pay, but a lot of safety issues and stuff that they were raising, none of that really got addressed. So, again, it seems to me we're going to be getting another incompetent Transport Canada minister, in my humble opinion. We'll see. I'll be watching very closely as to what he does with the overhaul of the key regulation on frontline rail worker training programs. And let's see. So anyways, again, we're not documenting stuff. We don't want to document the details. And when we do document, it's often inaccurate. I'm sure very much on purpose. And then it says, there were little, if any, formal quality assurance practices in place or evidence of safety management strategies being implemented prior to this occurrence. Well, in 2018, there was a review done of safety management systems and practices in the rail industry in Canada, and it was still proving to be a challenge to make sure that those things were there. And even after the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney in 2013, when the Health and Safety Officer for Transport Canada requested the safety management systems documentation from CN Rail, it was not released prior to the release of the report by the Health and Safety Officer. So, and again, it's Transport Canada's job to make sure that rail carriers are following the law. And so if this documentation and these practices are not in place, whose fault is that? The rail carrier, yes, but absolutely Transport Canada too, for not having it done its job to make sure that rail carriers are in compliance with all laws under which they operate. And when a CEO and these rail executives sign off on their annual reports that they operate within the laws under which they must operate for their financial statements when they disclose those, that's not just for accounting laws, folks. When you're signing off on that as a rail executive, you're signing off that you are in compliance with all laws under which you operate. And that would include these railway employee training programs and laws such as the Railway Safety Act and SOR 87-150, the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, and the labor codes, and on and on and on. But without ongoing audits to make sure that this is happening, that's why it keeps being the same issue over and over and over again. And almost 20 years after the Mackyard incident, these are the same issues that rail workers are dealing with. And the work environment has only gotten exponentially more dangerous because you get more and more fake qualifications, and it's the fake qualified that then go on to qualify and train newer employees, and on and on and on. People have no idea as to how bad things have become. And because these players, a lot of them have escaped to the US, it's not just Canada's rail industry that's impacted now. There's no less than 5 Class 1 rail carriers in the US that can be impacted by these same issues. So let's keep going here. It says the number of other serious occurrences. Oh, and by the way, before I move on, the safety management systems, regulations, and acts, those have been in place since 2001. So there's no reason for these to, for the implementation of practices pertaining to safety management systems to not be in place. They've had 24 years to get these to where they're supposed to be. That's a little much. And in my opinion, that is massive criminal negligence causing death. So it says here, the number of other serious occurrences in 2006 and 2007, and I would go on and say after this, 2008, because this report didn't come out until 2009, and so they also knew about the 2008 Mackyard incident. But it's not mentioned in here that, those 2 hidden and classified belt pack operations reports pertaining to Mackyard incidents. Why don't they even mention, 2008 here? But anyways, suggests, as stated in Transport Canada's audit, the audit was only looking at 2005 and 2006, not 2007. So again, no reason not to include 2008 here, but that the effectiveness of CN's safety culture improvement initiatives needs to be reviewed. Oh, we'll review that again. That'll be another safety action taken, another bogus safety action taken. We'll review that, right? They don't do anything. They give you a safety action taken, and it becomes either a total public scam or something that falls into a black hole. There's never any compliance audits, any follow-ups, anything to make sure that things are where they need to be. And I'm not talking about a once in a while compliance audit. I am talking about having ongoing audits for all of these issues in the rail industry. And that is not happening, and it needs to. So then it says the focus on training, involvement, communications, coaching, and recognition were not being effectively implemented. Well, surprise, surprise, Transport Canada and Transportation Safety Board. The Transportation Safety Board, who wrote this report, is also a rail partner in crime, as is very much seen in, these reports where we word it a certain way to kind of, not state We don't state in here that they're violating the Railway Safety Act. You don't see that anywhere. That this is a violation of the Railway Safety Act. This is a violation of the Railway Safety Act. You don't see that in these reports by the Transportation Safety Board. Why not? Why do you only, tell us, oh, this is a violation of rule whatever, or of this regulation? Regulations and acts are enforceable in court. That's why they don't want to tell you this is a violation of the Railway Safety Act. This is a violation of the Railway Safety Act. You would be seeing violation, 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 violation of the Railway Safety Act throughout these reports if they actually put that in there. And that would certainly be pointing the finger to Transport Canada, right? And to the rail carriers. And those would be things enforceable in court for which they can be sued. Oh, we don't want to point that out, right? Well, rail families need to wake up. Rail unions, wake up. We have the documentation now for you people to wake up and force the necessary changes in the rail industry in both Canada and the U.S. And then it says, in the absence of a process to review and incorporate student and conductor feedback into the training program, skill deficiencies will not be identified and addressed during the training programs. And not just that, skills and deficiencies go on to be, further solidified that, okay, this is how I was trained. I guess I'm doing it okay. And then accidents happen. And then people get killed or seriously injured. And then newer trainees are trained using, fake qualified, supposedly, supervising conductors who are themselves fake qualified. Or locomotive engineers who are themselves fake qualified. Because if you're fake qualified as a conductor, when you become a locomotive engineer, you don't restart all your training from scratch. So fake qualified as a conductor trainee, you've been fake qualified as a qualified conductor, and then you go on and you're still also fake qualified as a locomotive engineer, in my humble opinion. So it's very nasty. So when we get at, why do they write these reports the way they do? Who might they be protecting? Well, of course, the CEOs, the chief operations officers for sure, and the people in charge of Mackyard. And, well, we want to we'll write our reports and we'll let them move on, right? We'll promote the incompetent, as we so often do in office jobs. Well, it's a little more dangerous to allow the incompetent to be promoted in the rail industry so that they become, chief operations officers now at major Class 1 rail carriers. These incidents during the 2005 timeframe in Mackyard, the assistant general manager of Mackyard was John Orr. He was also general manager of Mackyard in 2006. In 2007, he went on to the Prairie subdivision, I believe, to Edmonton. But they don't tell us when in 2007. Would he have still been there in Mackyard during that first, hidden and classified Mackyard incident report, which happened in March of 2007? Would that have been under John Orr, or was he already gone? I have no way of knowing. But John Orr is today, because he was allowed to move on. He is now the Norfolk Southern Chief Operations Officer. If I'm a U.S. rail worker at Norfolk Southern, because Canada didn't stop this guy in his tracks, given all the violations of laws that were going on in Mackyard, all the things that were implemented in violation of the Railway Safety Act, and Canada didn't stop this guy in his tracks, in my humble opinion, U.S. rail workers have a good way to go after John Orr and sue him and sue Transport Canada and the government of Canada for criminal negligence. Because people are dying. And let us not, John Orr is a fairly recent, I think, Norfolk Southern Chief Operations Officer. I can't remember who was there before him. I'll have to be looking that up. But anyway, Norfolk Southern is the company that was involved in the East Palestine derailment. I don't think John Orr was there at that time, but who was there before him? Was it another CN employee who was chief operations officer? I don't know. I have to look that up. Anyway, and then we have, let's see, and then CN Rail chief operations officer. During this Mackyard incident and the two hidden belt pack, the two classified reports for belt pack, which I have to get my hands on. Well, the person who was CN Rail chief operations officer as of February 2007 would have been Keith Creel, who is now the CEO at CPKC. So again, U.S. rail industry, the people at the top of your company, in my opinion, should have been brought, in my opinion, they don't belong in boardrooms, they belong in courtrooms. My humble opinion. So we have two reports under Keith Creel when he was Chief Operations Officer at CN Rail that have been classified. Am I seeing a trend there that stuff is being hidden when it has to do with Keith Creel? If you remember in previous videos, there was a CP Rail Police after the big Field BC derailment, a CP police officer who was an investigator in that derailment that killed 3 frontline rail workers, the locomotive engineer, the conductor, and the conductor trainee were all killed when a train derailed in the mountains of British Columbia, because this crew was basically expected to move this train when they didn't have proper air pressure. And in an area where they were supposed to be going maybe 15 or 20 miles an hour, they ended up derailing at 56 miles an hour. That would have been under the operational excellence of Keith Creel also. And that CP Rail police officer who was investigating that acted as a whistleblower and told the press, I suspect a cover-up. I'm being told not to talk to witnesses, and on and on and on. And I think Keith Creel was threatening lawsuits or whatever. But anyways, that whole thing still I don't believe is settled. I think the families are still fighting that in court. But am I seeing a trend here? Are we at Transport Canada for some reason always protecting Keith Creel? How about declassifying those 2 belt pack incident reports that were classified when Keith Creel was overseeing operations at Mackyard? Because he was there during this whole Mackyard incident, as well as being Chief Operations Officer for the one previous to this one, and the one after, the 2 that were classified. Declassify that, Transport Canada. We want to see just how bad things were and are, because this is still going on, folks. People are still dying in belt pack operations. And there's no excuse for this. Like I said, these people belong not in boardrooms, but in courtrooms. That's my humble opinion. All right, in this next section here on the following page, we get into findings as to causes and contributing factors. So let's go through these. It says, when the Canadian National, or CN, West Control Hump Yard assignment, whatever, was placed in emergency, the only operable brakes were those of the locomotive and the booster unit. So in other words, when you're doing belt pack operations, all of the air brakes between the cars are not active. That's what that's telling you here. They only had the booster unit and the actual locomotive to stop this movement. And if you've got a movement that's heavy and long, and you have no air brakes for the rail cars to stop, and you could have very, very heavy rail cars with iron ore or, ballasts or rocks to go on the tracks. You could have steel on those cars. These cars are not light, folks. You could have grain in those cars. So they're not light. And all you have is the locomotive and the booster unit brakes. So it says the movement with limited braking capacity was too long, heavy, fast, and close to the junction with the occupied Halton outbound route to have been able to stop before colliding with train 339. So there's that issue. And then it says, although CN had certified the new conductor, should say, although CN had fake qualified the new conductor as being qualified to operate belt pack switching assignments, neither his training nor his experience was adequate for switching long, heavy cuts of cars on tracks with descending grades. Let's look at the next point. Without a complete understanding of the train's behavior under braking, and without a list of the cars and tonnage, they don't even have a list of what's in the cars and how much they weigh. So you don't know if your rail cars are empty or if they're loaded down with heavy, heavy stuff. So without a list of the cars and tonnage, the operator could not accurately estimate the stopping distance of this long, heavy train on the descending grade. Folks, this is an issue. Yeah, for this descending grade, you're going downhill and the train's picking up speed, so it's going to go faster. You may be having your train operating within the limits when you first do your belt pack movement, and controls using your little belt pack unit, but that train's not going to remain maybe at 12, 13 miles an hour if it's going downhill and it's loaded with heavy cars. It's going to accelerate. And so they talk about the long, heavy, to not even have, it's bad enough you don't have maps in the yard, but to not even have the list of the cars and the tonnage. In my opinion, folks, that's again criminal negligence causing death. Why would they not have the tonnage of the cars that they're moving? Huge, huge, huge issues again. But anyways, here we talk about descending grades. And yes, we would know that cars and trains absolutely accelerate when they're going downhill. The heavier, the faster the acceleration. But this is also an issue, folks, when you're going uphill. Because people are also using belt pack movements in rail yards where they're kicking rail cars uphill. So they have this pack on their chest, a locomotive, and remote control locomotive operation. And so they're using a remote control to move the locomotive or the booster unit to push rail cars and build trains in a rail yard. They're not physically on the locomotive. They're on the ground using a belt pack, which is something that fits on their chest, and it's a remote control operation unit. And so, yeah, remote control operations on descending grades are absolutely an issue, but they're also an issue on an ascending grade. Because if I don't know the tonnage, if I don't know what I'm moving and I'm just there kicking rail cars, I've been told move this car, this car, this car, and I just move them and I'm building this train and I'm pushing these rail cars uphill. Well, what if those rail cars are filled with ballast, which are the rocks that they put in between the railroad ties when they're building a track? What if they're filled with, some other heavy, dangerous goods, grain, whatever, steel? If you're going uphill and you didn't kick it hard enough for it to remain uphill and go to a flat area, then those rail cars that you just kicked uphill can slowly come back down the hill and cause a derailment or an accident, as was the case when a young conductor trainee by the name of Melissa Hines was killed in Saskatchewan in this very type of operation. And that yard, folks, is in Saskatchewan. And for those of you who don't know, Saskatchewan's in the prairies. It's pretty well all wheat fields. And these rail yards in Saskatchewan, they may look like they're flat, pretty flat, very, very little incline. But when you got those heavy rail cars and you kick it uphill, and you really haven't been trained on the impacts of tonnage and whatever, and boy, so the rail car that's heavy slows down as it's going uphill. It's a lot easier to kick empty rail cars up a hill, or maybe not so heavy a rail car up a hill, than it would be to kick ballast or grain or steel in rail cars up a hill. And so what happens is the rail car gets kicked going uphill, then it slows down because it's so heavy it can't quite make it properly up to the flat area, begins to roll back. By this time, the person operating the belt pack is likely doing another belt pack movement. And before they realize it, then they notice, oh my gosh, that rail car, that belt pack movement is coming back down the hill. And so just as what happened, and it's accelerating as it's coming downhill because it's heavy. And Melissa Hines, that was Railway Investigation Report R17, I believe it's T0267. But that young woman went after the belt pack movement that was coming back down the hill. She jumped on it, and the handbrake was up high. So she had to climb high to apply a handbrake. The handbrake failed because, and if you look into issues pertaining to maintenance in the rail industry, there are videos online. I had seen one where the guy was basically saying, we're given 90 seconds to inspect a rail car when it comes in. 90 seconds. Really? In the door, out the door. And in Canada, I believe that the Ministry of Labor is only responsible for guys that work in the actual garages where they fix rail cars and locomotives and whatever. They're not responsible for people that are, on trains or whatever. And so, well, if the handbrake's not working and I kicked it out the door, I didn't get killed working in the garage. So guess I don't fall under the labor code. Ministry of Labor's not involved, right? But what if that failure to fix that handbrake, and there's no regulation in place for the entire mechanism to be properly inspected when that rail car comes in to make sure all handbrakes are working before a rail car moves out the door. That rail car had been inspected about a month before Melissa Hines was killed. Why wasn't that handbrake working? So she jumps on this rail car, attempts to apply a handbrake. It fails. She's probably 10 to 14 feet up. The rail car is moving faster and faster downhill, and then it ended up colliding with another movement that she had been moving that she had to stop to go after the one that was backing up. They collide, and she gets killed, crushed between the two movements. A totally preventable accident. Had proper belt pack training been in place, that accident happened in 2017. That was more than 10 years after the Mackyard incident pertaining to belt pack. And there still was not proper regulations in place for the training of belt pack. And when we get into that, folks, you're going to see there's all kinds of issues that play into this whole belt pack training issue. And it's nasty. It is very, very nasty, in my humble opinion. Melissa Hines should never have died had Transport Canada done its job in the first place. Had regulators insisted that rail cars be properly inspected to make sure that no rail car that goes out of a yard, out of a, out of a garage, doesn't have a properly functioning handbrake. And I think there's actually a rule or a regulation that says that they're supposed to ensure that handbrakes are working prior to belt pack movements. And who's supposed to enforce that and verify that? Well, that would slow down operations, right? Melissa's death happened in Saskatchewan, where yards are fairly flat, and you can barely even tell that there's an incline there. But it doesn't take much when you got pretty heavy tonnage going uphill and then coming back down at you, right? So it's not just an issue when it comes to belt pack. It's not just an issue for descending grades. It is very much also an issue for any ascending grade. And when they did the investigation for Melissa Hines' report, and I have that one too, and there's a lot of lies in that report and inaccuracies if you ask me. But anyways, when they did that one, they had asked employees in that rail yard whether or not they had experienced rollbacks. And there were previous reports by Transport Canada for that yard having to do with rollbacks, and a lot more than one. So Transport Canada and CN Rail absolutely knew that they had problems with rollbacks in that yard. But they did nothing until this conductor was killed. But when they did an informal survey and asked people, have you experienced rollbacks? The report stated that many stated that they had experienced rollbacks when they were asked in that yard. Many. Oh, let's see. That sounds like more than a couple or a few or some. Many. And that's a pretty big rail yard. Many had experienced rollbacks. But CN waited and Transport Canada waited until someone was killed before addressing such a huge safety critical issue. Where were the safety management systems that were supposed to be in place? Right, Transport Canada? More blood on your hands, as far as I'm concerned. And more people are still dying in the rail industry. So, like I said, there's a lot of people who don't belong in boardrooms or in high political offices and in cabinet roles. They belong in courtrooms. And that is my opinion. We don't need people like this regulating the industry or overseeing it in any way. No. And I'm not waiting until my child dies to do something about this. So, anyway, we'll move on. It says here, without knowing the stopping distance, the operation of the movement did not meet the requirement of Rule 105 to be able to stop within 1/2 of the range of vision of equipment. Again, you'll note here, we're discussing Rule 105. Wait a minute, how about before that, you didn't discuss violations of the Safety Management Act, dating back to 2001. We're just going to discuss this rule because the rule's really not enforceable in court, right? But an act and a regulation, such as SOR 87-150, which is the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, which has not had any training for belt pack operators to this day. We tried to overhaul that as a result of the Mackyard incident. That was the whole public scam. Melissa Hines died because Transport Canada allowed a public scam rather than an actual safety action taken. And we're going to get into that public scam of a document that was the first attempt to overhaul frontline rail worker training programs. Transport Canada, Melissa Hines' blood is on your hands. There's no other way to put it. Proper programs should have been there when you did your first attempt to overhaul these training programs. You knew about tonnage issues. You knew about rollbacks, heavy trains, topography. You knew about all of this. You did nothing. And now, let's see, Melissa Hines died in 2017. And now that, I've spent years reviewing the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, and looking into a lot of other railway investigation reports. And now, let's see, 8 years after the death of Melissa Hines, Transport Canada is finally going to overhaul frontline rail worker training programs. And I suspect that's only because last year in 2024, I took my work, my research, to U.S. rail unions and key players in the U.S. And I popped this also on the desk of the person who was an assistant for then Senator J.D. Vance. And that was before he was picked to be Trump's running mate. So, and Transport Canada and the government of Canada, I told them, this is going to be your year of disclosure. And I guarantee you, that's why they are now hurrying up behind the scenes to try to overhaul frontline rail worker training programs. And they're still doing it wrong. We don't want to include track maintenance workers in those training programs. Why not? Stephen McKinnon, you'd better do it right, because we don't have another 38 years for Transport Canada to get it wrong. And get it wrong, Stephen McKinnon? And if rail workers die, especially track workers, breach of public trust is a criminal offense for which you can be found personally liable. And don't ever forget it. I will be sending you an email on that one, along with a whole lot of other documentation. You've already received a lot of it, Mr. McKinnon, when you were Minister of Labor during the CN and CP strike of 2024. So you know about some of these issues, sir. Can't wait to see how you're going to be addressing them as Minister of Transportation. And ask me if I trust you any further than I can throw you. Absolutely not. Anyway, so Rule 105 is mentioned, but not the acts, not the violations of acts, and not the violations of regulations. Oh, we're not going to point those out, because those are enforceable in court, folks. Then it says here under point 5, the 2200 West crew was not completing assigned work in the time available. They had 6 trains they were supposed to put together that night, and they were still on the first one when the accident happened. The railway expects that cars be moved at a speed as close as possible to the maximum of 15 miles per hour in a yard. So, geez, if I'm going on a descending grade at 15 miles per hour, how faster is that train going, that movement, which may be loaded with very heavy tonnage when it's approaching a train that is departing the yard on an adjacent track. Oh, yeah. So these factors likely contributed to the 2200 West being operated at an excessive speed. Oh, they don't tell you what the train was really operating at when it hit the other one, do they? Oh, we don't want to go there. Let's see. Then the decision to place a difficult to handle train in the hands of an inexperienced operating employee without an adequate job briefing contributed to the collision and derailment. Oh, the whole thing of an adequate job briefing. Yeah, that's required. You're supposed to have a job briefing before you get to work. Well, conductor trainee Jason Clooney was supposed to have a job briefing too. And when the work assignment changed, his second job briefing happened because there were so many crew members that day, there was 4 of them. Conductor trainee Jason Clooney, the supervising conductor, a locomotive engineer new to the territory, and the pilot locomotive engineer. Well, with that many employees, the conductor trainee Jason Clooney was in the second unit for pretty well the entire time that they were moving the train. And so when they were having their job briefing, before arriving at the last work location, he was basically, I believe, standing on the outside of a locomotive and being told what he was going to be doing. Oh, and the roar of that engine and the wind and the cold, that wouldn't have interfered at all with him understanding the job briefing, right? That was a proper job briefing for a conductor trainee? I don't think so. Findings as to risk. It says, while it may be expeditious, before I move on to that, the whole issue of wanting, putting pressure to move these cars, build these trains, that was also happening in my child's yard, where my child was expected to operate belt pack units and move. They were told they had to move up to 200 rail cars in one night shift, okay? The 2 guys who had the most experience in that rail yard had told my child, and they told my child that yard was so dangerous that you really shouldn't be doing belt pack movements in that yard unless you had like 5 years experience, is what I believe my child had told me. They had told them. And my child thought that was so dangerous what they were being asked to do, and the pressure to move rail cars, that my child and another employee had actually refused to engage in these belt pack movements because of the danger of rollbacks. And if I recall, my child was laid off shortly after refusing to do that, and the other person, the supervising conductor, my child was also a qualified conductor, and the other one who had a little more experience, he, I believe, received 25 demerit points. But when they went in front of the union and management for the supposed statement, the statement was written up not as a refuse to work for unsafe work conditions. It was written up as delay of assignment. You're not working fast enough. And so we're potentially going to give you 25 demerits. Really? So they're hiding key issues under the carpet by giving it a different name than refuse to work in dangerous work conditions. And so the issues don't get addressed, folks. They fall into a black hole and they are never addressed. And if my child was laid off, and they're laid off more than 28 days, and I believe they were, and they don't get to go in front of management with a union rep and whatever and have this whole issue resolved, I believe after 28 days, it's just thrown in the wastebasket. You can't bring it up anymore, and I can't get demerits. So for the rail worker, hey, they love it. They don't get the demerits. They don't have to spend the time going in front, of management to give their side of the story, whatever. It just disappears as an issue. A dangerous issue just disappears. It's either reworded as something else, or it is not even addressed because we allow time and distance to come into play. So I would ask the TCRC, the union that represents frontline rail workers, why are you not insisting on proper terminology when it's a refusal to work because of unsafe conditions? And why Are you not insisting that safety critical issues actually be addressed instead of allowing them not to be addressed? Are you just addressing that in your behind the scenes compensation discussions when there's a contract up for renewal? We're just going to, use this as a bargaining chip. We're not going to address the issue, but we'll use it as a bargaining chip to get a pay increase? Is that what you're just focused on, is the pay increase? Because then you get higher union dues? Why is the rail union, in my opinion, also a rail partner in crime? By sweeping these issues under the carpet. And as bad as the railway investigation report was for conductor trainee Jason Clooney, and all of the lies in that railway investigation report, and all the deceptions, and all the deadly training materials tied to that death. Look at the brainwashing series and the deadly training material series at Rail Families United on that YouTube channel. Why did the union not push those issues? They knew that those reports were full of lies. And worse, the VP of the TCRC, the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference, participated in a totally scam Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada hearing where they set dangerous precedents, making the rail industry even more dangerous for frontline rail workers. And the only witness to appear for rail workers was a VP of the TCRC who, in my opinion, was a rail partner in crime. Oh, and just as a coincidence, he ends up getting promoted to be a vice chair of the Canada Industrial Relations Board, which is the one when you have arbitration, when there's a strike by CN and CP and you have to send it to arbitration, that goes to the Canada Industrial Relations Board, the very place where that VP was promoted to as a vice chair. Not sure if he's still there, but kind of fishy, don't you think? Promoting the incompetent or promoting our rail partners in crime? Is that what that was? In my opinion, that's absolutely what that was. And you'll see that when we get into the video series I have to do on the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada hearing, where a decision was made that actually violated the regulation, SOR 87-150, the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. And the Government of Canada allowed that decision to be made when it violated a law which is enforceable in court. We're going to get into those issues too, folks. So let's keep going. Findings as to risk. While it may be expeditious to switch long cuts of cars relying only on locomotive brakes, this practice makes stoppage distances unpredictable and meeting the requirements of Rule 105 unreliable. Again, we're just going to talk about Rule 105. Let's not talk about violations of the Safety Management Systems Act, right? Or the fact that there are no safety management systems basically in place. And then it says, without mitigation of the risk, which would happen if you did have safety management systems in place and practices, yard collisions involving long, heavy consists will continue to occur. But again, we're not going to discuss the fact that the Safety Management Systems Act is being violated here, right? Let's not discuss that issue. Let's focus just on those rules that aren't enforceable in court, right? And then it says, while conductor trainees receive basic instruction and testing in handling yard movements as part of their belt pack course, their class, they do not receive specific instruction or practical experience on the effects of tonnage, length, marshalling, or topography on braking distances. The marshalling is where how you decide what kind of cars to place. Like, you don't want to put all the heavy cars together and then have all the light cars in one spot in your movement. You need to stagger them um, to help prevent derailments. Okay, so, and then let's see. Then it says, in the absence of such training and with no special operational restrictions placed on these newly trained personnel, conductors are inadequately qualified to safely operate yard movements at all times. So, they're fake qualified, they don't have the experience they need or the knowledge they need. That's the bottom line. And we're not going to talk about the acts and the regulations being violated. We're just going to talk about the rules in these documents by the Transportation Safety Board, right? Right. Before we move on from this page 24, I need to discuss an issue here at the bottom where it says, in the absence of such training and with no special operational restrictions placed. That's an issue for more than just newly qualified conductors. It's also an issue for when somebody is laid off, and you could be very experienced, okay? And let's say that you're so experienced that you've moved on from being a qualified conductor, and now you're actually a locomotive operator, okay? And you're an engineer. But, oh, the business is really slowing down. We're in a recession. The company is laying off a whole bunch of employees. And so instead of being a locomotive engineer, I'm back down to being a conductor. And it might be years since I did belt pack operations or engaged in the roles of a conductor on the ground. There's no retraining that happens. There's no refamiliarization, nothing. You're just, you're just expected to go out there and do the work. And I don't know that that's right. And I really have to wonder if this issue played into the death of a railroader by the name of Luke Lumley. And he actually worked for Ontario Northland, which is a province of Ontario rail line. And Luke Lumley was a qualified locomotive engineer. But the day he was killed, he was on the ground. So who was moving the train when he was killed? Was he being asked to work as a conductor that day? I don't know. But I'll tell you something. I've started going to funerals. If they're close enough, I'll go to that funeral. You know, if it's 4 hours away, 5 hours away, I can go to that funeral. And if I have enough time to plan, I could even go further than that. And I've started going to rail yards and handing out business cards with my YouTube channels to actual frontline rail workers. And there was something just yesterday in the news on Luke Lumley that it's been almost a year and it's still under investigation, right? Well, when I went to that funeral, I actually talked to Luke Lumley's brother, and I told him, you need to be aware that Transport Canada is lying to rail families. And I had just briefly talked to him and a couple of other people that day, and told them to, look for the information I'm going to be putting out because it was coming. But yeah, I have no problem going to funerals and to start making contact with rail families who are left devastated because Transport Canada has so failed to do its job. And Premier Ford of Ontario, Luke Lumley died under your watch, and you've been on the distribution list for years. For as long as you've been Premier of Ontario, you've known of these issues of placing inexperienced people there and of fake qualifications. And so, I really wonder if that whole issue of reassigning someone to a previous role with no refamiliarization, no retraining of any kind, even for just a few days, just to get you back up to speed to what this previous role was that you used to do maybe years ago. There should be some kind of retraining there going on and refamiliarization, doing the actual work before you go from one position back down to another that you may not have done in years. And that happens all the time in the rail industry, folks, and I think it's a serious issue. And I really can't help but wonder if it played into the death of Luke Lumley at Ontario Northland. So, just saying, I'll be keeping an eye on that one too. Okay, so now we're up to page 25, and here it states, the qualifying test to certify conductors in belt pack yard operations is not sufficiently rigorous to evaluate conductor trainee skills under work conditions. Consequently, trainees without the required skill or experience are being placed in active service without restrictions on their duties. And we're going to get into an entire deception that happens as far as what is an experienced conductor when we get into the belt pack training series. Major, major deception in my humble opinion. And then it says, in the absence of a process to review and incorporate student and conductor feedback into the training programs, skill deficiencies will not be identified and addressed during the training program. Well, yeah, it's a free-for-all. You could have a different trainer every single day instead of having one or a couple, and then they meet to discuss your progress and your deficiencies. Then it says, when operating trains in a large complex rail yard, for example, Macmillan Yard, a site map including track layouts and, a list of cars with tonnage would be useful job aids to be given to conductor trainees and newly qualified conductors. So yeah, having maps, definitely a big plus. Nobody, even a very qualified conductor or locomotive engineer, should be expected to memorize hundreds and hundreds of tracks or hundreds and hundreds of switches. If Mac Yard has 200 tracks, at minimum, it would have about 400. That would be the very minimum number of switches. One for getting in, one for getting out. So you can't expect anybody to memorize this. And if the likes of John Orr or Keith Creel think that that's possible, you go for it, bud. Why don't you draw us a bunch of maps of Mac Yard and label all those switches for us and see how well you can remember all that. Yeah, let's do that. Let's give them that test. And likewise, as far as the Field BC derailment, when you want change in the rail industry, if you want real change, you force these executives to go work in the conditions they expect other people to work in. Hey, Keith Creel, you came up through the ranks. And John Orr, you too, I believe. You're experienced conductors, right? Go back and do these belt pack operations and move 200 cars in one night. Let's see how well you do. Or why don't you get on a train like the Field BC train that couldn't get proper air pressure because it was so cold that night. And that car sat for quite a while before the new relief crew got on it. I think that rail executives should be forced to do ride-alongs during the coldest weeks of the year in mountainous terrain. And they should be allowed to be at the controls because we allow managers at the controls, right? So let's do that. You want real change in the rail industry? That's how you're going to get it. You force Transport Canada's Ministers of Transportation, the Rail Safety Directorate. You force people at the Transportation Safety Board. You force people who are rail executives to go and engage in the very things, the very work conditions in which they expect frontline rail workers to work. I guarantee you would be seeing some quality improvements in rail operations. That's what you're going to need to do. My humble opinion, it'll be the quickest way to turn things around. And you also need to, of course, put in place compliance audits, ongoing compliance audits, to make sure people are properly trained, and that if anybody requires extra training or wants extra training, not just that the supervisor says they don't need any. If somebody wants extra training in mountainous terrain or whatever in belt pack, they should be allowed to get it. It's cheaper to give a person a little bit of extra training than to keep going out and hiring all these new rail workers. Oh, but wait, we love that employee churn. And you know, when they did the Canada Industrial Relations Board arbitration for the CNCP strike that happened in 2024, one of the things that came out of that was that the union, they complained that they had so much of a backlog of all these, statements that they had, these notices to appear for rail workers, where they have to appear in front of management, give their side, whether or not they get demerits. One of the things that came out of that, the union and the rail companies scrapped, well, at least at CN, I don't know if CP did, but CN certainly did. They got rid of all pending notices to appear for demerits or whatever. They seem to get rid of all that. Why did they do that? Weren't those deserved? Were you trying to get rid of some of the key documentation that might show some of these problems? Is that what was going on there? New Minister of Transportation, Stephen McKinnon? Or TCRC? Why is this going on that all of a sudden we're going to wipe the slate clean for everybody and we're going to restart from scratch? What was the real justification for that? Were you trying to purge your personnel records? Is that what you did? That would be my guess. And if that's the case, because if we're just going to purge everything and everybody's fine, we're going to get rid of everybody's demerits, you're all getting a new slate. How fair is that to the people who were fired, who got demerits? That's a whole issue too, isn't it? Anyway, in the next video, on video 11, we're going to be getting into safety actions taken. And folks, I still haven't finished the Mac Yard incident report. I think it goes up to page 31. So we're going to be covering that in the next video. And then after that, I'll be doing the series on what came out of this safety action taken that we're going to be covering in video 11. And you're going to see, this is what I call the total public scam safety action taken. And you'll see why after we do this section, this next video. But it was a total and complete public scam. And had this been done properly and followed up on, in my opinion, Melissa Hines would still be alive. But hey, Transport Canada and the Transportation Safety Board and the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada are nothing more than rail partners in crime. They're to provide appropriate cover-ups for their rail partners in crime in the rail industry, right? So there's a lot more good stuff to come, folks. All right, so I'm going to pick up in part 12 with the safety action taken as a result of the Mac Yard incident. So we'll go through all of that. And then after that, I will be getting into the public scam document, which resulted from that safety action taken. And so on that note, I will say have a great day, and I will see you in part 12.